In my last tutorial, I went through the structure and content of this essay, and worth noting is at the bottom of that essay, the writer had quite a few sources. This enabled her to read up on the content, to take good notes, and to see things from a wider perspective, which enabled her to discuss independently in her essay. Now let's take a look at the introduction and conclusion of that same essay. The structure of the introduction introduces the topic of your essay. It provides a more general statement. It sets the scene for the discussion. It builds up to the thesis statement, and it concludes with the specific thesis statement. Note, write your main body paragraphs after you have composed a good thesis statement. After your main body paragraphs, write your introduction and conclusion. See separate guide for how to write an essay. The content of the introduction can provide historical background, outline the present situation, define terms, address specific arguments, present a problem, and so on. So let's analyze this introduction. Notice that with the title and the first few lines, the writer introduces the topic of this essay, but also provides a more general statement that engages the readers. Voter suppression against Black Americans. Racism and voter suppression targeted against Black people have a long history in the U.S. Racism in America is a phenomenon as old as the country itself, beginning with the first African slaves brought to the colonies several hundred years ago. After the British colonies declared their independence in 1776, the slaves were still not seen as equal to whites. Therefore, the rights given in the Declaration of Independence and later the Constitution did not apply to them. This included the right to vote and participate in the newborn democracy. Next, the writer sets the scene for the discussion in the main body. Voter suppression against Black Americans did not end there, but is still highly visible in the United States today. The result of said suppression is that a group of people are being disenfranchised from having a say in policies that may affect their everyday lives. And finally, with these sentences, she has also built up to the thesis statement. So let's take a look at the thesis statement. In other words, Black voters have faced and still face voter suppression, but nonetheless their votes were crucial in the 2020 U.S. presidential election. And finally, notice the content of the introduction. First, in the first few lines of the introduction, the writer provides historical background. And then, beginning with voter suppression against Black Americans, she outlines the present situation, but also continues with the specific arguments or the consequences. And finally, she presents a problem, a specific problem, and perhaps also addresses a type of solution in her thesis. And finally, the conclusion, structure and content, begins by somehow referring to the thesis. It summarizes the essay and refers to the main arguments. It does not introduce new information, and it leaves the reader with a sense of completion or closure. Notice in the conclusion that the writer begins by somehow referring to the thesis, then summarizes the essay and refers to the main arguments, and then finally leaves the reader with a sense of completion in the last line. So let's begin. Despite efforts to deter Black people from having their voices heard in the election, their votes still had an important impact on the results. So directly referring to the thesis. Racially biased voter suppression is not a new thing, but rather a common occurrence in the history of American elections. The recent presidential election was no exception, and many Black votes may have been disqualified. Given the country's history, it seems that while voter discrimination based on race is unconstitutional, racist politicians endeavor to find ways to diminish Black people's political influence. This in turn limits their ability to affect the way the USA is run and the policies that might affect their everyday lives. So here she summarizes the essay and refers to the main arguments. And finally, nonetheless, This year, Black voters showed up in impressive numbers and made their mark on the 2020 U.S. presidential election. The writer leaves me, the reader, you, the reader, with a sense of completion and closure, while also actually referring back to the thesis. So perhaps now you can see why it's never a good idea to begin writing an introduction or conclusion without having completed your thesis statement and your main body paragraphs. If you know what you have written, it is far easier to begin and end an essay successfully. Thus, clear effort put into the structure and the content of your introduction and conclusion will help you on your way to achieving higher competence in written English. I would like to give a special thanks to Pernille Amdahl Franknes for permission to analyze and publicize her outstanding essay.